Hey, today I'm talking about implicit bias. Implicit bias is a term that has gained a lot of traction recently, with movements such as Black Lives Matter using it to define the current political landscape. Implicit bias can be as simple as assuming one's heritage to expecting a person to behave a certain way. What separates implicit bias from explicit bias is that the person using implicit bias generally won't realize that they are in fact acting on perceived notions that affect their actions. Everyone is affected by implicit bias. My first argument would be for you to close your eyes and picture a successful person. This is an obvious cliche, but it is still very powerful. The person you picture falls into one of two categories. Either they look like you or one of your parents, or they look like what society tells you is successful. The fact that this imagined person looks a certain way and not like the cover of a Tool album is because you are affected by implicit bias. You may not realize it, but the ideas we have on how things should be, ideas we form growing up, affect our views. If you think that only men can hold a position implicitly, then when a woman comes around, they will have to work twice as hard to win you over. Another simple test to see if you are affected by implicit bias in terms of gender will be to play a little word association. Disclaimer, obviously everyone has not had a vanilla life, but bear with me. Here we go. Caring, breadwinner, strong, fashion forward, good with hands, writer, professor. You know that your answers should be gender neutral, but at some point you thought something different from what you explicitly believe. Some are pretty forgiving associations. My mother raised me, and my father worked. These are harmless, but they become harmful when you assume that your upbringing is the objective truth. This subconscious belief will come out at certain times. If you think a woman is meant to fit a mold, a woman breaking that mold will seem hostile when they are in fact just working towards something just like anyone else. Implicit bias has found its way into the current political climate surrounding race relations in America. Groups like Black Lives Matter and intersectional feminists have begun calling Americans out on their implicit bias. The backlash comes from the fact that no one likes to be told that they are secretly biased. We all have a friend of color, admire a powerful woman, or have a gay friend. So how can I be racist, sexist, or homophobic? Treating a person like a human being doesn't mean that you aren't affected by implicit bias. I will admit that when I interact with a person of color, I try to be very careful with what I say as to not make them feel uncomfortable. I'm sure that they can sense the undertone of my actions. I know that I am affected by implicit bias, and I try to counteract it. And that's kind of the key. Once everyone understands that there is implicit bias in the world, we can move towards treating the symptoms. If you understand that you think a certain way, you can slowly change it. If you subconsciously think that a race should be a certain way, and you understand that you are infected by implicit bias, then the next time you interact with said race, you might be able to catch yourself. It will be embarrassing, but it will help you overcome the negative effects of your bias. Obviously, there is such thing as good bias. I am a cisgendered white male in America. This country's bias helps me in a lot of ways. This is why it's important for people like me to understand the impact that implicit bias plays in decision making, because the 114th Congress looks a lot like me. In conclusion, we, as a species, need to understand that implicit bias affects us all. 40,000 years ago, in the swamps, snap judgments helped us survive, but as 2016 comes to a close, the impacts of implicit bias are going to become more and more apparent.